The air in Calth's Underdistrict, specifically Sector Gamma 9 Habs, wasn't just air. It was an experience, an olfactory assault that began the moment the transit cage doors hissed open. It wasn't the uniform. Recycled staleness one expected in the upper hive levels, filtered and refiltered until it tasted of nothing but weary machinery. No, down here, beneath the gleaming, rebuilt surface cities that basked in the carefully managed glow of Calth's artificial replacement sun, the atmosphere was a complex, layered entity, thick with history and decay. First, the sharp, metallic tang of corroded plasteel and rusting iron, bleeding ochre tears into stagnant pools of brackish, unidentifiable fluid that shimmered faintly under the sparse lumen strips. Then, the acrid bite of promethium seepage, a constant reminder of the failing infrastructure, leaking from cracked conduits buried deep within the ferrocrete strata above, a scent both volatile and cloying. And underpinning it all, a dry, powdery bitterness, irradiated dust, a fine gray talc disturbed by the shuddering groans of ancient, overburdened ventilation systems. This was the ghost of the Day of Revelation made manifest, the lingering poison seeded by Lorgar's treacherous word-bearers when they burned this world from orbit 10 millennia ago. A poison that even centuries of ultramarine resilience, terraforming efforts, and relentless rebuilding hadn't fully purged from the planet's deepest wounds. I tasted it on my tongue, a gritty film coating the back of my throat, a perpetual unwelcome reminder of precisely where I was. Precinct 347. Sublevel Tertius, the sump end of the Imperium. Even by the bleak standards of Calth's sprawling Underdistrict, I stood on a precarious mesh grate platform, its metal groaning softly under my weight, overlooking what the locals charitably called a thoroughfare. Below stretched a wide, debris-strewn tunnel, a forgotten artery of some long-dead infrastructure project. Sputtering lumen strips, spaced erratically along the tunnel ceiling, cast cones of weak, flickering light that seemed only to deepen the surrounding pools of absolute darkness. Water, or perhaps something significantly less wholesome, judging by the iridescent sheen on the puddles below, dripped with maddening rhythm from unseen pipes high overhead, each drop echoing unnervingly in the oppressive quiet. The quiet itself was a violation. Even in the most neglected hab zones, there was usually a background hum. The thrum of distant machinery, the roar of mag trains on buried lines, the closer skittering of hive vermin, or the shouts of desperate commerce. Here the silence felt curated, watchful, a heavy blanket smothering all but the most insistent sounds. The drip, 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 the groan of stressed metal, and the mechanical wheeze of my own respirator unit, working overtime against the particulate-laden air. My designation, should anyone down here care, is Malachi Vorn, formerly Lex Mechanic Grade 4, Administratum Tithes Division, Sector Primus, Calth Surface Operations. A life measured in data slates, logistical forecasts, and the satisfying click of correctly balanced ledgers. Now I'm just Vorn, a name stripped of rank and relevance, reassigned to the ingloriously titled Department of Special Investigations, Underdistrict Affairs. The euphemism was so transparent it felt like a deliberate mockery. My fall from the meticulously ordered world of surface bureaucracy hadn't been precipitated by grand heresy, sedition, or even significant embezzlement, merely by competence and inconvenient timing. A series of meticulously researched data correlations, cross-referenced shipping manifests, and harvest yield analyses had unfortunately illuminated significant grain tithe diversions, tracing a clear path to a minor but well-connected scion of House Locastus, one of Calth's established noble families. Instead of commendation for uncovering corruption, I received censure for procedural overreach, an immediate, punitive reassignment. 17 years dedicated to the Emperor's bureaucratic machinery, ensuring the smooth flow of resources vital to the segmentum, replaced overnight by the prospect of wading through literal filth, chasing shadows in the bowels of a world still weeping psychic and physical wounds inflicted during the Horus Heresy. My current assignment, delivered not via secure Vox link or encrypted data codex, but on a grime-stained, flickering data slate, handed over by a sullen-faced local enforcer whose carapace armor looked like it had lost several arguments with heavy machinery, was grim even by the standards of Precinct 347. Disappearances. In the Underdistrict, people vanished constantly. Life was cheap currency, easily spent. Gangers eliminated rivals in brutal, unseen skirmishes. Slaver rings preyed on the desperate and unwary. Mutants, lurking in the unexplored, irradiated tunnels of the ruined districts, occasionally dragged victims away for purposes best left unimagined. Standard operational hazards. But this pattern was different, unsettlingly so. Over the past 3 standard Terran months, 12 individuals had vanished without a trace from Sector Gamma 9 and the adjacent, largely shunned Fiutu, the ruined district, zones notorious for scavenger dens, fringe tech-heretic workshops, and desperate communities clinging precariously to the edges of heresy-era devastation zones. The key difference? No trace. No ransom demands, no witnesses reporting struggles, no bodies turning up later in refused chutes or nutrient reclamation vats. Just absence. An erasure. The victims themselves were a disparate group, lacking obvious connections. Some scavengers who scraped a living, filtering toxic sludge. Tunnel rats who navigated the labyrinthine serviceways. A couple of members of the Iron Veins, a local ganger clan known more for petty extortion than organized crime. And crucially, the disappearance that finally triggered this reluctant investigation. A mid-level Guilder representative named Horst, who had been negotiating water purification contracts, and his 2 hired bodyguards. The only common threads were the general location, the fringes bordering the ruined district, and the unnerving, absolute lack of evidence. The local enforcer detachment, perpetually understaffed, under-equipped, and deeply cynical, had logged the initial reports with bureaucratic apathy. Only when the Guilder vanished, threatening disruption to vital water supplies and prompting angry inquiries from the surface, did they reluctantly request Administratum assistance. Assistance in the form of me, someone expendable, possessing just enough analytical acumen to potentially spot a pattern where brute force had failed, or, more likely, to simply compile a sufficiently detailed report confirming the investigation's futility, allowing the case to be officially closed and forgotten. The locals, in hushed tones laced with fear, had already given the perpetrator a name: the Veiled Butcher. A name born from the phantom-like nature of the disappearances, the lack of struggle, the absence of remains. It implied a chilling stealth, a surgical precision disturbingly at odds with the usual crude brutality of Underdistrict violence. My investigation, like all Administratum endeavors, began with data, or more accurately, the glaring lack thereof. Precinct 347's cogitator hub wasn't the gleaming data sanctum of the surface, but a cramped, damp, mold-infested chamber tucked away in the precinct sub-basement. Ancient cogitator stacks, relics from centuries past, sputtered fitfully, their casings coated in grime and condensation. They were tended by a single ancient tech adept named Luxor, whose flesh seemed as gray and porous as the fungus growing on the walls, his movements slow, his optical implants clouded and dim. He communicated in binary clicks and wheezes, eventually producing the relevant files after much coaxing and the application of sacred oils, or perhaps just lubricant, to a protesting access port. The disappearance files were predictably sparse, riddled with inconsistencies, hearsay, and the weary indifference of the recording enforcers. Picked captures from HAB unit security networks were invariably corrupted by static radiation interference, or simply showed empty corridors moments before the estimated time of vanishing. Witness testimonies, when available, were a morass of contradictions, fueled by fear, superstition, and cheap synthale. Some spoke of seeing a tall figure wrapped in pale rags drifting through the tunnels like mist. Others recounted hearing disembodied whispers promising escape from the Underdistrict's misery, or revealing the location of hidden archaeotech, luring victims away. A few mentioned a sudden, unnatural drop in temperature, a chilling psychic coldness, preceding the moment someone vanished. Utterly useless from an evidentiary standpoint, yet painting a consistent picture of something uncanny, something beyond mundane criminality. I spent 2 cycles cross-referencing the victim's known associates, routines, deaths, declared enemies, and known haunts. I accessed Guilder manifests, Iron Veins rumored territory maps, crudely drawn and likely inaccurate, and scavenger trade logs salvaged from Luxor's sputtering machines. Nothing concrete emerged. No single rival gang benefited significantly. No known slaver ring operated with such subtlety. The victims came from different social strata, such as they existed down here, different gangs, different scavenger crews. The only solid links remained their shared geographical misfortune, proximity to the deeper, more unstable levels of the ruined district, and the recurring anomaly noted in the Enforcer patrol logs. Faint, localized energy signatures detected near several disappearance sites. Unusual chronoton fluctuations, trace biosignatures of unknown origin, residual psychic echoes, all dismissed by the precinct commander as sensor ghosts, equipment malfunction, or simply background radiation from Calth's perpetually wounded planetary crust. But 12 disappearances, 12 anomalous readings, coincidence felt increasingly unlikely. Frustration gnawed at me. Data analysis had hit a wall. If answers existed, they weren't in Luxor's moldering archive. They were out there, in the dripping tunnels, in the shadowed ruins where the butcher walked. A physical inspection was the necessary, unpleasant next step. Equipping myself from the precinct's meager stores, a standard-issue auto pistol with 2 spare power cells, a heavy-duty lumen torch whose beam seemed reassuringly bright, a portable Auspex scanner calibrated for atmospheric and energy readings, my trusty data slate, and a respirator unit fitted with filters rated for toxic and irradiated environments. I descended, leaving the dubious relative safety of Precinct 347's grimy Ferrocrete corridors. I entered the true Underdistrict, the warren of interconnected tunnels, collapsed hab blocks, and shattered infrastructure that bled into the ruined district proper. The transition was immediate and visceral. The air grew heavier, colder, the metallic tang intensifying, now mingling with the unmistakable stench of organic decay, and something else, something I couldn't initially place, a faint, almost floral scent, unnervingly sweet, disturbingly out of place in this subterranean wasteland. The sputtering lumen strips became scarcer, their weak light swallowed by the encroaching darkness. Soon, illumination came only from the flickering chem lights maintained by territorial scavengers, casting pools of lurid green or sickly yellow light, or simply from the powerful beam of my own torch cutting a swathe through the oppressive blackness. The architecture devolved. Utilitarian Imperial Gothic, however decayed and stained, gave way to shattered, cyclopean remnants of pre-heresy structures. Walls of fused and vitrified rockcrete bore the ghostly, heat-scorched outlines of ancient Prometheum fires, testament to the apocalyptic fury unleashed 10,000 years ago. Makeshift shelters clung precariously to these ruins, constructed from scavenged scrap metal, sheets of rusted plating, and fragments of shattered plasteel, huddled together like frightened animals. Down here, the silence deepened further, broken only by the furtive scuttling of unseen things in the walls, the distant, mournful groan of the planet's stressed crust settling, and the constant, unnerving drip of unseen fluids. My first objective was the last known residence of Jax, one of the missing Iron Veins gangers. His hab was little more than a reinforced alcove carved into a section of collapsed transit tunnel, identifiable by the crude, spray-painted gang sigil, a clenched metal fist gripping a vein, beside the entrance. The door, a heavy sheet of salvaged plasteel, was crudely welded shut from the outside. Standard Underdistrict practice when someone vanished unexpectedly. It prevented immediate looting by rivals or opportunistic scavengers, preserving assets until the gang leader decided the owner wasn't coming back. It spoke volumes about the value of life down here. I activated my portable last torch, the focused beam hissing as it sliced through the rough welds. The door swung inward with a groan of protesting hinges, revealing the interior. The space was small, cramped, smelling of stale sweat, cheap synthale, and weapon-cleaning solvent. Yet it possessed a rough kind of order. A stained sleeping pallet lay rolled in one corner. Empty nutrient paste tubes were piled neatly beside a sputtering water recycling unit. Crude tools for maintaining his stubber and chain knife were laid out on a makeshift workbench. Nothing seemed overtly disturbed, no signs of a violent struggle. I swept the beam of my lumen torch across the walls, the floor. Nothing. I activated the Auspex. Background radiation slightly elevated, consistent with this sector. Trace biologicals matched Jax's archived profile: sweat, skin cells, hair follicles. Standard. Then, a flicker near the back wall. The wall itself was a section of the original tunnel lining, heavily scarred by ancient heat, almost melted in places. The Auspex chirped, registering a faint, localized chronoton field distortion, the same temporal anomaly mentioned in the Enforcer logs. And something else the patrols hadn't detected or hadn't bothered logging: microscopic particulate matter suspended in the air near the wall. Non-metallic complex organic structure, unknown classification. I carefully deployed sterile collection vial 7B, waving it gently through the air near the wall, sealing it with a silent prayer to the Omnissiah that the sample would survive analysis. Examining the scarred wall more closely, my lamp beam caught something almost invisible beneath layers of grime and heat damage. A symbol, delicately etched or perhaps burned into the vitrified rockcrete. Not the Iron Vein's fist, nor any standard gang tag or heretical mark I recognized from Administratum archives. It was a complex spiral, tightly wound, interwoven with sharp, angular lines that gave it an unsettling, organic yet geometric feel. At its center, a single, elongated teardrop shape, making the entire symbol resemble a stylized weeping eye. It felt ancient, alien, and deeply unsettling. Looking at it made the back of my neck crawl, a primal instinct screaming of wrongness. My next stop was the last known location of Horst, the missing Guilder representative. His duties had taken him deeper into the ruined district, near the sealed entrances to sublevel Quartus. Tunnels officially interdicted centuries ago due to extreme residual radiation levels and catastrophic structural instability from the heresy bombardment. Horst had been attempting to negotiate water purification rights with a semi-organized scavenger community known as the Deep Dwellers, who claimed access to less contaminated underground aquifers. A risky venture, even for a Guilder with armed guards. His chronolocator and those of his bodyguards had abruptly ceased transmitting near the ruins of a pre-heresy Medicae station, a skeletal structure half buried in rubble. Reaching the station required navigating treacherous, debris-choked tunnels, where my rad counter chirped with increasing frequency. The structure itself was a grim monument to futility. Buckled ferrocrete walls, collapsed ceilings, smashed Medicae equipment looted generations ago. Stagnant, slime-covered water pooled ankle-deep on the cracked floor, reflecting the beam of my lamp in disturbing, shifting patterns. The air here was thick, heavy with the smell of antiseptic decay, but overlaid with that same incongruous, sweet floral scent, much stronger now, almost cloying. I swept the auspex around. The chronoton distortion was significantly more potent here, a localized temporal eddy centered on a large pile of rubble near the station's former triage area. Precisely where Horst's locator last pinged. The auspex also registered higher concentrations of the unknown organic particulate. Carefully, mindful of potential booby traps or unstable footing, I began shifting the rubble. Smashed plasteel casings, corroded medical instruments, bone fragments likely dating back 10,000 years, but nothing belonging to Horst or his guards. No weapons, no armor fragments, no bloodstains, no sign whatsoever of the violent struggle one would expect if 3 armed individuals were overcome. It was another clean disappearance. Then, beneath a heavy slab of fallen ceiling plating, my glove brushed against something small, delicate. A single, perfectly formed flower petal, unnaturally white, almost luminous in the gloom. It felt cool, slightly waxy to the touch, but crumbled instantly into fine gray dust the moment I tried to pick it up. And etched into the underside of the heavy slab, protected from the elements and decay, was the same symbol, the weeping eye spiral. Clearer this time, more deliberate. The butcher had definitely been here. A pattern was solidifying, disturbing in its implications. The disappearances weren't random acts of violence. They were targeted, meticulous, centered around locations marked by this strange symbol, and characterized by anomalous energy readings and biological traces. The butcher wasn't just killing, they were harvesting, leaving behind only cryptic symbols, strange scents, and unsettlingly clean scenes. The floral element was particularly baffling. Flowers down here, in the irradiated, polluted depths of Calth's Underdistrict, it spoke of something unnatural, something bioengineered, something cultivated. My investigation necessarily led me deeper still, pushing the boundaries of my authorization and the limits of my respirator filters. I moved through territories claimed by flickering chem lights and crude barricades, past tunnels slick with phosphorescent, mutated slime where things with too many legs or too few eyes skittered away from my light. My rad counter became a constant, unwelcome companion, its insistent chirping a reminder of the invisible poisons soaking into the very fabric of this place. I bartered information from wary scavengers huddled around meager fires fueled by burning refuse, their faces gaunt shadows in the flickering light, eyes wide with a mixture of fear, suspicion, and desperate hope when they saw my Administratum seal, or perhaps just the nutrient bars I offered. Most were tight-lipped, terrified of attracting the butcher's attention or retribution from local gangs like the Iron Veins or their rivals, the Chem Dogs. But a few, their desperation outweighing their fear, or perhaps lubricated by the promise of clean water purification tablets, offered fragmented whispers, stories dismissed by the enforcers as sump gas-induced delusions. They spoke of the Whisper Man, a tall, veiled figure seen drifting silently through the deepest ruins, sometimes leaving behind strange pale flowers that wilted instantly in the torchlight. They recounted tales of people hearing voices calling their names from the darkness, seductive whispers promising escape, hidden archaeotech caches, or reunion with lost loved ones, shortly before they vanished forever. One ancient woman, her face a terrifying mask of radiation burns and weeping sores, clutching a crudely carved aquila charm made from scavenged bone, spoke in a trembling voice of the Calth sorrow. An old Underdistrict legend dismissed by surface dwellers of something ancient and vengeful sleeping in the deepest, most irradiated caverns beneath the ruins. Something that fed on grief and despair, awakened by the psychic trauma of the heresy. She claimed the weeping eye spiral was its mark, a symbol of the planet's unending tears. Superstition, born of ignorance and fear? Almost certainly. Yet the resonance with the symbol, the disappearances, the butcher's methods, it was deeply unsettling. The deeper I descended, the more the environment itself seemed to reflect the butcher's influence, or perhaps the influence of the Calth sorrow itself. The sweet, cloying floral scent became almost a constant presence, sometimes strong enough to make my head swim, masking the usual stench of decay. Patches of unnaturally vibrant, pale fungi, resembling clusters of weeping eyes or tear-stained petals, pulsed with faint, cold bioluminescence on corroded walls and ceilings. The air grew heavier, crackling with static electricity that made the fine hairs on my arms stand on end, and the whispers at the edge of hearing became more insistent, more personal, sometimes seeming to coalesce into my own name, Malachi, spoken in a sibilant, genderless voice that seemed to echo from the rock itself. My Auspex readings became increasingly erratic. The background radiation fluctuated wildly, spiking unpredictably. The chronoton distortions became more frequent, more intense, sometimes causing my chrono to skip seconds. And the concentration of the unknown organic credits rose exponentially, forcing me to change respirator filters far more often than regulations recommended. Were these spores? Some kind of nanite? The delivery mechanism for the butcher's influence? I discovered more sites marked with the weeping eye spiral, always in locations steeped in trauma and death. A mass grave from the heresy, hastily sealed behind cracked ferrocrete, from which a faint coldness emanated. A collapsed ultramarine command bunker, littered with the corroded remnants of power armor and bolters, where the psychic echo of desperate last stands was almost palpable. An underground chapel, its altar desecrated, where terrified survivors had prayed for deliverance from the word-bearer's orbital bombardment, their pleas unanswered. Near these sites, the butcher had left more signs, discarded Medicaid tools arranged in precise, ritualistic patterns, pools of the black, ichor-like substance, thicker here, resembling dried blood mixed with crushed spores, and the offerings. Small, perfectly preserved anatomical fragments placed carefully within the center of the spiral symbol. A single finger bone, polished smooth, a lock of greasy hair tied with wire, a glass eye staring blankly, a child's milk tooth, tokens left by the harvester, still no bodies, no significant remains. Just these chilling, meticulous leavings. The psychological toll was becoming severe. Isolation, constant tension, pervasive darkness, sensory deprivation alternating with olfactory and auditory assault. It was a textbook recipe for cognitive degradation. Paranoia became my constant companion, whispering doubts, amplifying fears. Every flicker of movement in the periphery, a rat, a falling piece of debris, a trick of the light, sent jolts of adrenaline through my system, leaving me trembling and nauseous. I started seeing the veiled figure in shadows that weren't there, hearing the sibilant whisper even when the tunnels were silent. Was it the spores affecting my perception? The cumulative stress? Or was the butcher truly stalking me now, aware of my investigation, playing with me? My sleep became a luxury I could barely afford, snatched in brief, nightmare-ridden intervals, huddled in defensible alcoves, my auto-pistol clutched tightly. The nightmares were relentless. Swirling darkness filled with weeping eyes, the suffocating scent of unseen flowers, the feeling of cold, probing tendrils exploring my mind, the butcher's veiled face looming over me. My carefully cultivated Administratum detachment, my reliance on logic and procedure, began to crumble, replaced by a raw, primal instinct for survival. My log entries became terse, fragmented, focusing on rad counts, filter changes, ammunition levels, and potential escape routes, rather than objective analysis. I was becoming one of the hunted, one particularly grueling cycle, while navigating a treacherous maze-like section of sublevel Quartus, an area officially marked on Administratum charts as Irradiated Catacombs Access Forbidden Penalty, Summary Execution. I followed a particularly strong chronoton signature, hoping it might lead to Horst's body or some definitive clue. The tunnels here were choked with the skeletal remains of pre-heresy vehicles, fused into the rockcrete by unimaginable heat. The radiation was intense, my hazard suit's integrity indicator flashing amber. The floral scent was overpowering. And then I found it. Not another disappearance site, but something far more disturbing. Tucked away behind a curtain of fused rubble and sparking power conduits, within the shell of what might have once been a Munitorum archive or scriptorium, was the butcher's sanctuary. It was a relatively small, cleared space, eerily clean compared to the surrounding devastation. The walls, however, were a horrifying tapestry. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of weeping eye spirals adorned every surface, drawn meticulously in the dried black ichor, overlapping, creating a dizzying, nauseating effect. They pulsed with a faint, sickly purple light, casting the chamber in a grotesque illumination. In the center, upon a makeshift altar constructed from broken statuary, fragments of imperial eagles, shattered aquilas, the serene faces of forgotten saints, lay a macabre collection. Personal effects of the missing: Jax's tarnished knuckle duster, Horst's ornate gilder seal stamped into wax, the crudely carved wooden aquila belonging to a missing child named Ilara, a sororitas prayer bead, a scavenger's filtration mask, dozens more pathetic, intimate remnants of lives extinguished. And scattered everywhere, like obscene confetti fallen from some nightmare parade, were drifts of the desiccated white petals, ankle-deep in places. The air here was thick, almost unbreathable, saturated with the cloying floral scent. It pulsed with tangible energy. The chronoton distortion so intense it made my teeth ache and my vision shimmer. My auspex shrieked multiple warnings: extreme radiation, unknown biological contaminants, high-level psychic resonance. The resonance signature was unlike anything I had ever encountered. Cold, ancient, profoundly sorrowful, yet underpinned by a predatory, calculating intelligence. This was the heart of the butcher's web, the nexus of its power. As I cautiously swept my lamp beam across the horrifying chamber, heart pounding against my ribs, the light fell upon a data slate lying partially buried under a pile of petals near the base of the altar. Unlike the damaged, inert slates I'd found elsewhere, this one seemed functional, its screen flickering with faint lines of text. Kneeling carefully, avoiding disturbing the petal drifts, I deployed my data interface tool, whispering a silent prayer to the Omnissiah for function and clarity. Fragmented log entries appeared, the script a disturbing mix of archaic Calth and Gothic, precise anatomical diagrams that scrolled past too quickly to decipher, and strings of complex biochemical formulae. The author referred to themselves only as the botanist, or sometimes, chillingly, the gardener of grief. The entries chronicled a horrifying obsession. They spoke of cultivating the sorrow bloom, a unique psychotropic fungus apparently native to Calth's deepest, most irradiated caverns, mutated further by the psychic trauma of the heresy. The botanist believed this fungus could be harnessed, refined, integrated with human hosts to create a new form of life, one perfectly adapted to Calth's wounded state, capable of drawing sustenance directly from the planet's psychic pain. The log detailed experiments, failures, the refinement of techniques for harvesting resonant grief from victims, targeting individuals experiencing intense sorrow, loss, or despair. The disappearances weren't murders in the botanist's warped perception. They were transplantations, graftings, necessary steps in creating a veiled garden where flesh and fungus merged, transcending the limitations of both. The ultimate goal, chillingly expressed, was to rebloom Calth from its ashes, to transform the entire Underdistrict, perhaps the entire planet, into a single unified consciousness of sorrowful fungal perfection. The butcher wasn't merely killing, it was converting. The final entry, dated only hours before my arrival, sent a fresh wave of cold dread through me. Subject 13 acquired. Prime specimen. Iron veins enforcer designated Jax. High grief resonance following recent territorial loss. Integration protocols initiated. Tissue acceptance nominal. The veiled garden nears completion. Soon, all Calth shall weep and bloom anew in eternal sorrow. Jax wasn't just missing. He was Subject 13. He was part of this horror. The botanist. The veiled butcher. Not just a deranged killer or a simple mutant. A sophisticated heretic, a biomagus of terrifying skill, conducting obscene experiments, twisting life, grief, and the planet's own history into monstrous creations. The flowers, the spores, the chronoton distortions, the psychic whispers, all tools, all part of this horrifying gardening. Where did such knowledge come from? Was it rediscovered pre-heresy tech? Xeno's influence? Or something born purely from the warp-tainted depths of Calth itself? As the last line of the log faded from the screen, a sudden, unnatural cold draft snaked through the chamber, extinguishing the data slate's weak light. The overpowering floral scent intensified, becoming thick, cloying, making my stomach churn. The whispers returned, no longer tentative probes at the edge of hearing, but a direct, sibilant voice slithering inside my head, cold and mocking. Curious little scribe, digging where you shouldn't, disturbing the blooms, you smell of stale data and fear, not enough grief in you, not yet, but potential. The voice felt ancient, layered, like multiple entities speaking in unison, yet focused with singular, chilling intent. I spun around, auto-pistol instinctively raised, my lumen torch beam cutting through the sudden deeper gloom that had fallen over the chamber. Standing silently in the ruined doorway, where nothing had been moments before, partially obscured by shadow and a swirling mist of pale, shimmering spores, was the figure from the Underdistrict whispers. The botanist, the veiled butcher. It was tall, unnaturally thin, almost skeletal beneath its strange attire. It was clad in overlapping layers of what looked disturbingly like cured, pale human skin, or perhaps some kind of tough, leathery fungus, stitched together crudely with thick, dark fibers that seemed to pulse faintly. The garment clung tightly, hinting at an inhuman anatomy beneath. Its head was completely covered by a heavy, deep cowl and a thick veil woven from the same luminous white, petal-like material I'd seen scattered everywhere, obscuring any hint of features beneath. In one elongated, multi-jointed hand, it held a long, wickedly thin blade that shimmered with a faint, sickly green energy. Likely a phase knife or some other exotic, lethal technology capable of bypassing armor. In the other, it cradled a single, perfect white bloom, larger than the petals I'd seen, that pulsed slowly with a faint, cold, internal light. It didn't radiate heat, only a profound, soul-chilling coldness that seemed to leach the warmth from the air. The creature, for it certainly didn't feel human, didn't move like anything natural. It seemed to drift, to flow across the debris-strewn floor, its movements unnervingly silent, fluid, graceful, in a horrifying, insectile way. It left no footprints in the drifts of petals. The air around it crackled almost visibly with contained energy, the chronoton field intensely focused, making the fillings in my teeth ache and the lenses of my optical enhancers distort. "Identify yourself," I commanded, my voice betraying a tremor despite my best efforts to project the Emperor's authority. "In the name of the Holy Inquisition and the Administratum of Calth, cease your abominable activities, surrender for judgment." A desperate bluff. My actual authority was negligible, and judgment down here rarely involved surrender. A low chuckle echoed from behind the veil, a dry, rasping sound like dead leaves skittering across ferrocrete, layered with a faint, wet clicking. The sound scraped against my nerves like fingernails on slate. Inquisition? Administratum? Meaningless titles, echoes of a dying order built on lies and ignorance. Dust on the wind, Only the sorrow is real. Only the bloom matters now. Its roots run deep, little scribe, deeper than your Imperium dreams. You intrude upon sacred work. You disturb the garden before its full flowering. It raised the hand holding the pulsing white flower. The bloom flared brighter, its cold light intensifying. It released a dense, visible cloud of shimmering, iridescent spores that drifted rapidly towards me, moving against the faint air currents, drawn by my body heat, my life force. My respirator roared, its filters instantly beginning to clog, the warning rune flashing angry red. Despite the filtration, I felt a wave of profound dizziness, a sudden, overwhelming surge of crushing despair wash over me. Not just my own anxieties, but amplified echoes of Calth burning 10,000 years ago, the psychic screams of billions incinerated, the unending grief of the survivors trapped in the Underdistrict, my own petty failures and regrets magnified into soul-crushing burdens. The sheer weight of sorrow was staggering, threatening to buckle my knees, to extinguish the flickering flame of my will to resist. Images flashed behind my eyes. Jax's face, contorted in terror as tendrils enveloped him. Horst, screaming silently as his essence was harvested. The little girl, Ilara, weeping for her lost wooden Aquila. Resist, I snarled through clenched teeth, fighting the psychic onslaught, the litany of mental fortitude, a desperate subvocalized mantra. I forced myself to fire the auto pistol, aiming center mass. The shot slammed into the figure's torso, tearing through the outer layers of its strange leathery garment. It staggered back a step, more from the kinetic impact than actual injury it seemed. A faint hiss, sharp and sibilant like pressurized gas escaping, emanated from behind the veil. Then it lunged. It didn't run. It flowed, covering the distance between us with blinding unnatural speed, the shimmering green blade tracing a deadly silent arc aimed directly at my throat. I reacted purely on instinct, years of ingrained survival protocols kicking in. I threw myself sideways, tumbling clumsily behind the dubious cover of the makeshift altar, the blade slicing through the air where my head had been millisecond before. It sheared through the ancient stone of the altar as if it were ceramite foam, leaving a faint, shimmering trail of disrupted molecules that quickly faded. Scrabbling backwards on the petal-strewn floor, heart hammering against my ribs, I brought the auto pistol up again, emptying the remaining rounds in the power cell into the advancing figure's center mass. It absorbed the shots with unnerving indifference, the impacts creating small craters in its leathery hide that seemed to writhe and seal themselves shut, almost instantly, with pale, fibrous tendrils that emerged and retracted like disturbed worms. Its veiled head tilted slightly, as if analyzing the weapon's capabilities with cold detachment, finding them wanting. Flawed flesh, weak weapons, the butcher whispered, its voice now devoid of mockery, replaced by a flat, analytical tone that was somehow more terrifying than outright malice. It continued its relentless, gliding advance, cornering me against the pulsating wall covered in weeping eye symbols. Your grief is shallow, underdeveloped, barely a whisper compared to the symphony of this world's agony. But your life force possesses potential, untapped resonance. You will suffice, another root for the garden, another voice for the choir of sorrow. You will bloom beautifully, little scribe. My auto pistol clicked empty, useless metal and plastic in my trembling hand. My lumen torch flickered violently, its beam weak and erratic, threatening to plunge me into absolute darkness, casting wild, dancing shadows that made the figure seem to multiply, to loom impossibly large. The spores were making me nauseous, my vision blurring at the edges, the despair pressing down like a physical weight, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. Panic, cold and sharp and tasting of bile, threatened to overwhelm my training, my discipline, my very sanity. I was trapped, weaponless, injured, facing a creature of unknown origin and terrifying power, a being that shrugged off gunfire, wielded psychic despair like a bludgeon, moved like a phantom, regenerated from injury, and intended to absorb me into its horrifying biological collective. This wasn't just a heretic or a mutant. This was something fundamentally other, something ancient and alien, something born from the deepest, most poisoned soil of Calth's nightmare past, empowered by 10,000 years of accumulated suffering. Desperate, my eyes darted around the chamber, searching frantically for anything, any advantage, any hope. The data slate I dropped near the altar, the broken statuary, The pulsating symbols covering the walls radiating that cold energy. An idea, fragile and desperate, sparked in my Administratum-trained mind. A mind accustomed to finding patterns, exploiting loopholes, understanding systems. Not combat tactics, I was no soldier, but system disruption. The chronoton field, the psychic resonance, the symbols. The butcher seemed intrinsically tied to this place, drawing power from the ambient psychic trauma of the heresy, focused and amplified through the network of symbols covering the walls. If I could disrupt that connection, sever it, even momentarily. If I could introduce chaos into its carefully cultivated resonance, perhaps I could weaken it, buy myself time, create an opening however small. My portable Auspex lay shattered nearby, its multi-frequency broadcast function useless now. But tucked into a pouch on my utility belt, almost forgotten, was a standard Enforcer pattern sonic stun grenade. Primitive technology designed primarily for non-lethal crowd control or disorienting unarmored gangers in hab-block riots. Its effectiveness against a creature like the Butcher was highly questionable, but its purpose was to generate chaotic high-frequency sonic energy, pure disruptive noise. Perhaps that noise could interfere with the delicate psychic resonance the Butcher seemed to rely on, just as my overloading Auspex burst had momentarily staggered it earlier. It was an infinitesimal chance, a prayer whispered into the teeth of oblivion, based on half-remembered Scala Progenium lectures on localized warp phenomena suppression and sonic dampening fields. With the Butcher momentarily paused again, perhaps savoring its perceived victory, perhaps analyzing my failing biosigns with its cold alien intellect, or perhaps simply preparing the optimal method for transplantation, I fumbled at my belt pouch, my fingers clumsy and numb with cold and fear. I pulled out the small, cylindrical stun grenade, its casing cool against my sweaty palm. Thumbing the activation stud felt like signing my own death warrant. 3-second fuse. Hope? The Butcher whispered, tilting its veiled head again, the swirling void within seeming to focus intently on the small device in my hand. Its voice held a note of something that might have been curiosity, or perhaps amusement. A fleeting, illogical chemical reaction. Like grief, it can be harvested, refined, added to the bouquet. It glided forward again, faster this time, the shimmering green blade raised high for the final, killing strike. The air grew colder still, frost forming on the nearby rubble. For the Emperor! I yelled. Not a prayer this time. Not really, but a final, defiant expulsion of air, a refusal to die silently. I didn't throw the grenade directly at the Butcher. Its hide seemed too resilient. Instead, banking on my disruption theory, I hurled it with all my remaining strength towards the densest concentration of weeping eye symbols pulsing on the wall directly behind the creature. The grenade detonated mid-air with a high-pitched, physically painful shriek of pure sonic energy. A wave of disorienting noise designed to incapacitate biological nervous systems through sensory overload. The effect on the psychically resonant chamber and on the Butcher was far more dramatic and catastrophic than I could have possibly hoped. The sonic blast slammed into the network of pulsating symbols like a physical hammer blow against resonant crystal. The eerie purple light flared violently, then shattered into a million fading fragments. The symbols themselves seemed to writhe in agony, then dissolved into fading static, their connection broken. The oppressive psychic pressure in the room vanished instantly, like a switch being thrown, replaced by a deafening silence in my mind that was almost as jarring. The Butcher screamed. Not a whisper, not a hiss, but a high, thin, unearthly sound of pure agony and systemic shock. Staggering back violently, dropping its flower, clutching its veiled head with both hands. The shimmering green energy around its blade flickered erratically and died, leaving only dull metal. The figure itself seemed to become less substantial, its outline wavering, flickering like a dying picked feed, patches of its leathery garment dissolving into drifting spores. The disruption was profound, severing its connection to its power source, throwing its alien physiology into chaos. It hadn't destroyed it, not yet, but it had hurt it badly, disconnected it momentarily from the sorrowful symphony it fed upon. Seizing the infinitesimal opportunity, fueled by a surge of desperate, unexpected hope, I scrambled away from the altar, ignoring the searing pain in my body, grabbing the only weapon available, the heavy, meter-long shard of jagged plasteel I'd used earlier to pry open Jax's door. It wasn't elegant, wasn't blessed, wasn't even designed as a weapon, but it was solid, heavy imperial material, and right now it felt like the Emperor's own vengeance in my hand. With a raw yell torn from my lungs, a sound more animal than human, I charged the staggering, disoriented figure. It tried feebly to raise its now dull blade, tried to lash out with its root tendrils, but its movements were sluggish, uncoordinated, its previous terrifying grace gone. I swung the heavy plasteel shard like a headsman's axe, putting every ounce of my weight, my fear, my desperation, my righteous fury into the blow, aiming for the veiled head, for the source of the whispers, for the heart of the bloom. The impact was immensely, viscerally satisfying, a solid, wet crunch that echoed in the sudden silence. The butcher's head snapped back violently under the force of the blow. The cowl and veil tore away completely this time, revealing the full horror beneath. Not a face, not even the swirling void I'd glimpsed before. Instead, the cowl had concealed a grotesque, pulsating mass of pale, translucent fungal matter, like some obscene brain coral, interwoven with strips of stretched, weeping human skin, recognizable patches belonging perhaps to Horst, to Jax, to the others, and embedded with multiple glassy, unblinking eyes harvested from its victims. They stared sightlessly in all directions, reflecting my own horrified face in their dead surfaces. At the very center of this obscene cranial growth, nestled within the fungal folds like a monstrous pearl, was a single, large, perfect white sorrow bloom, its petals slowly, rhythmically unfurling and contracting, pulsing with faint, cold light, the core of the entity, the control node, the heart of the butcher. The creature shrieked again, a bubbling, gurgling sound this time, stumbling backwards, clawing instinctively at its exposed, hideous head, the stolen eyes rolling madly in their fungal sockets. It was wounded, badly, its central processing unit, its connection to the sorrow bloom, disrupted and exposed. But it wasn't dead. Pale, thorny tendrils erupted from its body like frantic serpents, flailing wildly, trying to reform the protective veil, trying to strike at me, to defend the bloom. Before I could press the attack, before it could recover or lash out effectively, before the fragile advantage was lost, the sound of salvation roared from the corridor outside, the unmistakable, blessed thunder of Adeptus Astartes' heavy bolter fire. Discipline bursts, chewing through the ruined doorway, echoing like the Emperor's own judgment in the confined space. Explosions ripped through the scriptorium entrance as crack grenades detonated, sending debris and clouds of dust flying. Target acquired. Xenoform designation Gamma Psi confirmed. Purge the abomination. Leave nothing. For Calth. For Guilliman. The amplified voice, resonant with certainty and controlled fury, brooked no argument, cutting through the chaos. Through the swirling dust and smoke kicked up by the explosions, they appeared. 3 figures clad in the iconic cobalt blue power armor of the Ultramarines chapter, symbols of the 13 Legion, gleaming even in the dim light filtering through the dust. Veterans, their armor bearing the scars of countless battles, purity seals fluttering from pauldrons like defiant banners. One laid down, suppressing fire with a heavy bolter, the shells chewing chunks out of the far wall and impacting the butcher's flailing form. Another advanced steadily, a heavy flamer held at the ready, its pilot light casting an orange glow. The third, clearly the sergeant judging by the iron halo atop his helmet, and the Terran pattern power sword crackling with lethal blue energy in his gauntleted fist, advanced with measured, implacable steps, his gaze fixed on the wounded creature. They must have been on a deep reconnaissance patrol, perhaps drawn by the chronoton signatures I had been tracking, or maybe alerted by the sonic grenade's powerful detonation echoing through the ancient tunnels. Their timing was nothing short of miraculous. The butcher, wounded, disoriented, its grotesque head exposed, turned its remaining fury and hatred on the Space Marines. It screeched, a sound of pure, spiteful agony, and launched itself forward in a final, desperate charge, ignoring the heavy bolter fire that tore through its regenerating hide. It moved with a desperate, final burst of speed, its now dull blade flashing towards the sergeant. The sergeant met the charge unflinchingly, a blue statue of imperial might. His power sword became a blur of blue energy, parrying the strike with contemptuous ease, the impact sending sparks flying. "Brother Marius, cleanse," he commanded, forcing the butcher back several steps with a powerful, contemptuous shove from his armored boot. The Marine wielding the flamer nodded curtly, uttering a brief prayer to the Emperor and Saint Astrava. A bitter, terrible irony, I thought, given the butcher's possible origins. He stepped forward, bracing the heavy weapon, and unleashed a roaring torrent of jellied, burning promethium. The stream engulfed the shrieking butcher and the obscene petal-strewn altar behind it in an instant inferno. The creature thrashed and burned, its leathery hide blackening and splitting, its stolen eyes melting and running like wax, the sorrow bloom at its core blackening, curling, and finally bursting in a shower of burning spores. Its final shriek was a drawn-out, bubbling, gurgling sound of agony and utter despair that seemed to claw at the very air before finally fading into the roar and crackle of the flames. The psychic static vanished completely, leaving only the roar of the flamer, the smell of burned fungus and promethium, and a profound, blessedly empty silence in my mind. The oppressive weight lifted, leaving me gasping, trembling, suddenly aware of the crushing exhaustion and the searing pain from my own minor injuries. The sergeant deactivated his power sword, the lethal blue crackle dying with a soft hum. He surveyed the burning pyre for a long, silent moment, ensuring the creature was utterly consumed. Then he turned his impassive, helmeted gaze towards me, where I stood trembling, leaning heavily on my plasteel shard, covered in dust, ichor, and the lingering scent of burned sorrow. "Identify yourself, civilian." His voice, filtered through the helmet vox, was calm, controlled, utterly devoid of surprise at finding a lone Administratum scribe amidst such carnage. "Maliki," I managed, my voice hoarse, tasting ash and relief. "Administratum Special Investigations, Precinct 347. Assigned to investigate the disappearances. The entity you just destroyed, the data slate I found called it the botanist. The locals called it the veiled butcher." "You found it?" The sergeant grunted, his tone neutral, offering no judgment, no commendation. He gestured towards the burning remnants with his sword tip. "Or it found you. Some manner of warp-infused mycological xenoform, apparently cultivating itself using residual psychic trauma from the heresy. We have encountered similar, though less developed, manifestations in the deeper scar tissues of Calth. This one was unusually potent, unusually organized." He keyed his helmet vox again, his voice crisp and efficient. "Squad Ultima, Sergeant Valerius reporting. Hostile entity designated Xenotype Gamma Psi neutralized at coordinates appended. Request immediate dispatch of Tech Marine contingent and an Apothecarian biohazard sanitation team. Potential airborne contaminants and residual psychic taint confirmed. Secure the perimeter. One civilian survivor, Administratum designation Malachi Vorn, secured." He looked back at me, his blue eye lenses seeming to bore right through me, assessing my state, my potential threat level. "You are fortunate we were conducting deep sweep protocols and detected the energy surge from your sonic device, Administratum. Another minute, and you would have become part of its garden." Luck, the Emperor's improbable grace, the sheer dumb fortune of the universe. Or perhaps the calculated efficiency of an Ultramarine's patrol grid. Whatever it was, I didn't question it. I was alive, breathing air that no longer felt actively hostile, the oppressive psychic weight lifted, the whispers silenced. For now, the aftermath unfolded with the cold, detached efficiency characteristic of the Adeptus Astartes. The Ultramarines secured the ruined scriptorium and the surrounding tunnels, establishing a hard perimeter with crackling energy fields and watchful sentries. Brother Marius continued to cleanse the area with methodical bursts from his flamer, until nothing remained of the butcher or its obscene altar but blackened scorch marks, melted stone, and the lingering smell of sterilizing chemicals. Soon, the heavy, rhythmic tread of more power armor announced the arrival of reinforcements. A Tech Marine clad in artificer armor, accompanied by hovering diagnostic servitors carrying heavy scanning equipment, and an apothecary in stark white plate, his narthecium gleaming, attended by a retinue of Medicae servitors and hazard-suited chapter serfs. The Tech Marine immediately set to work, deploying arcane scanners, muttering binary cant over the vox, his multiple mechadendrites probing the walls, analyzing the residual energy signatures, taking samples of the vitrified rockcrete where the symbols had been. His preliminary assessment, relayed over the squad vox, spoke of complex chronoton displacement fields, bioresonant psychic amplification, and non-standard organic particulate exhibiting mutagenic properties. The apothecary, Brother Chirurgeon Titus, turned his stern, analytical attention to me. Despite my protests that my injuries were minor and my primary concern was filing my report, he subjected me to a thorough, invasive bioscan right there amidst the ruins, his narthecium humming ominously close to my face. He took samples of my blood, skin scrapings, even a sample of the air exhaled from my lungs, sealing them meticulously in stasis vials labeled with my designation and potential biohazard warnings. "Minimal spore inhalation detected," he pronounced finally, his voice filtered and toneless, devoid of bedside manner. "Trace psychic residue consistent with Class 3 mimetic assault exposure. Recommend Level 3 decontamination protocols and mandatory psychological observation." He seemed far more interested in me as a potential vector of contamination or a data point for Zeno's study than as a survivor of a horrific encounter. I was questioned again, this time by Sergeant Valerius himself, within a temporary command post established near the scriptorium entrance, a hastily erected prefab structure shielded by portable null-field emitters that hummed faintly, creating a bubble of sterile reality amidst the surrounding decay. The sergeant sat behind a makeshift table constructed from ammo crates, his helmet off now, revealing a stern, weathered face marked by service studs and old scars, his eyes the piercing blue common to Guilliman's sons. He listened impassively without interruption as I recounted my investigation from the beginning. The initial assignment, the frustrating lack of data, the descent into the ruins, the discovery of the symbols and the particulate matter, the interviews with scavengers, the increasing environmental anomalies, and finally, the discovery of the lair, the data slate, and the confrontation with the botanist. I emphasized the entity's apparent connection to the Heresy-era trauma, its bioengineering capabilities, its use of spores and psychic manipulation. I described its appearance, its abilities, the nature of the psychic assault, and the desperate, perhaps foolish, use of the sonic grenade that had ultimately created the opening for his squad's intervention. I presented the fragmented data slate I had salvaged before the apothecary arrived, its surface now wiped clean of petals but still feeling unnervingly cold. The sergeant examined the data slate briefly, handing it off to the tech marine for deeper analysis. He listened to my account, his gaze steady, occasionally making notes on his own data slate. He asked sharp, precise questions, focusing on the entity's regeneration, the nature of the whispers, the exact appearance of the sorrow bloom. He seemed particularly interested in the weeping eye spiral symbol. When I described it, he had me draw it carefully on his slate. He studied my crude sketch, then compared it to images stored within his tactical command interface, his expression tightening almost imperceptibly. "This marking," he said finally, his voice low, tight with controlled anger and perhaps something else. "Recognition? It has been associated with other incidents. Deep-range patrols encountering pockets of unnatural fungal growth in previously stable catacombs, reports of temporary madness among survey teams, psychic disturbances bleeding through even shielded vox nets. We suspected isolated mutant cults, perhaps dormant Xenos influence seeding the ruins. This botanist. This garden concept suggests something more insidious, something actively cultivating the planet's psychic wounds, perhaps even directed." He looked directly at me, his blue eyes seeming to pierce through my carefully constructed composure. "You were fortunate, Lex Mechanic Vorn. Extremely so, and perhaps unexpectedly resourceful for one of your calling. Your disruption of its resonant field, however unorthodox, undoubtedly provided the tactical advantage needed for swift neutralization. It was the closest thing to praise I expected to receive from an angel of death, and it felt strangely hollow." My escort back to Precinct 347 was conducted by two silent ultramarine scouts in lighter carapace armor, their presence a clear message. I was under observation, not entirely trusted. They ensured no detours, no conversations with the few wide-eyed scavengers or gangers who watched our passage from shadowed alcoves. At the precinct, I underwent the prescribed Level 3 decontamination, a series of harsh chemical showers that stunned the eyes and throat, radiation scrubs that left my skin feeling raw, and finally, exposure to psycho-indoctrination reinforcement hymns blasted at painful volume within a resonance chamber, designed to scour away any lingering mimetic taint and reinforce Imperial loyalty. It left me physically clean but mentally raw, shivering, and feeling more violated than purified. I filed my final report, Form 77 Gamma, Disappearance Analysis, electronically from Luxor's sputtering cogitator terminal, the ancient machine seeming almost cheerful compared to the horrors I had witnessed. I detailed the investigation objectively, the discovery of the botanist-veiled butcher entity, classified as xenotype Gamma Psi per Astartes designation, its methods, its apparent motivations gleaned from the fragmented data slate, and its neutralization by Sergeant Valerius's patrol. I included my analysis of the chronoton distortions and particulate matter as likely components of the entity's environmental manipulation and conversion process. I strongly recommended the permanent sealing and periodic Astartes sweeps of sublevel Quartus and adjacent ruin districts, adding a classified addendum detailing the weeping eye spiral symbol and suggesting potential links to previously logged anomalous incidents, accessible only to level Omega clearance or Adeptus Astartes command. I carefully omitted any mention of the whispers calling my name, the true depth and personal nature of the psychic violation, the unsettling resonance I felt with the creature's sorrowful logic, and the disturbing possibility that the butcher might have been merely a symptom, not the root cause. Some truths are too dangerous, even for classified Administratum records. Let the Ultramarines, with their centuries of experience dealing with Calth's unique brand of darkness, handle the deeper implications. My task was merely to report the weeds I had found, not to map the entire poisoned garden. The precinct commander, Prefect Grust, a bloated man whose uniform strained at the seams and whose enthusiasm for his job seemed to have evaporated decades ago, barely glanced at the report summary before applying his authorization stamp with a wet smack. Case closed. Threat neutralized by Adeptus Astartes' intervention. He seemed immensely relieved, primarily because the pressure from the guilders regarding Horst would cease, and the responsibility for whatever horrors lurked deeper in the ruin district now rested firmly with the Space Marines. My request for immediate reassignment back to surface duties, citing psychological trauma, residual health concerns from spore exposure, and the successful completion of my assigned task, was approved with unprecedented, almost suspicious speed. It seemed everyone involved, from Grust to perhaps even Sergeant Valerius, was eager to remove any witness who had delved too deep into Calth's lingering sorrows and returned. The ascent in the groaning transit cage, leaving behind the pervasive stench, the oppressive gloom, the watchful silence of the Underdistrict, felt like surfacing from a deep, drowning nightmare into blinding, unfamiliar light. As the artificial sunlight of Calth's surface flooded the cage, I closed my eyes, breathing in the filtered, sterile, blessedly neutral air. Trying consciously to purge the memory of the cloying floral scent, the image of the weeping eyes embedded in fungal flesh, the chilling sibilant whispers. I returned to the meticulously ordered world of towering data stacks, fluctuating tithe percentages, complex logistical forecasts, and the comforting, soul-numbing anonymity of the Administratum cog machine. But the transition wasn't clean. It never is. The scars remained, unseen beneath my neatly pressed scribe's robes, but profoundly felt. The silence of my assigned HAB unit on the surface, once a welcome respite from the noise of the bureaucracy, now felt unnervingly similar to the watchful quiet of the butcher's territory, pregnant with unspoken threats. Shadows in the corners of my vision sometimes seemed to coalesce into tall, thin, veiled figures, dissipating only when I looked directly at them. The faint scent of ozone from the HAB's air recycler occasionally carried phantom undertones of cloying sweetness, making my stomach clench. Sleep offered little escape. The nightmares persisted, less frequent perhaps, thanks to the mild sedatives prescribed by the apothecary, but no less vivid when they came. Swirling darkness, endless fields of weeping white flowers growing from cracked ferrocrete, the feeling of cold, probing tendrils wrapping around my mind, the hideous composite face of the butcher looming over me, whispering promises of blooming sorrow. I threw myself into my work with renewed, almost frantic diligence, seeking refuge in the cold, hard logic of numbers, regulations, and statistical projections. I requested extra shifts, volunteered for the most tedious data collation tasks imaginable, anything to keep my mind occupied, to build walls of mundane routine against the encroaching memories. to silence the echoes of the whispers. I avoided unnecessary social interaction, finding the mindless chatter of my fellow Lex mechanics unbearable, their petty concerns about promotions and ration quality trivial compared to the existential horrors I had witnessed. Yet, sometimes late in the Calthan-regulated night cycle, when the artificial sun dimmed to a soft twilight glow and the vast city outside hummed with its own mechanical sleep, I would find myself standing before the reinforced plasteel window of my hab unit, staring down at the distant, inaccessible darkness of the Underdistrict far below, a darkness that felt less like an absence of light and more like a living entity. And sometimes, unconsciously, my finger would trace a complex spiral pattern onto the condensation-fogged surface, a spiral like a weeping eye. I tell myself the butcher is gone, utterly destroyed, its physical form annihilated, its psychic resonance shattered by the Emperor's angels of death. I tell myself the whispers were merely psychic residue, the phantom sense a product of trauma-induced hallucination, the nightmares a temporary affliction that will fade with time, prayer, and adherence to prescribed psycho-conditioning regimens. But deep down, in the quiet, carefully guarded core of my being, a cold sliver of doubt remains, sharp as the butcher's blade. The data slate spoke of a garden, of transplantations, of Subject 13 nearing completion, implying a process, a network. The butcher I faced, was it the gardener itself, the sole architect of this horror? Or was it merely one of its blooms, one of its more successful creations sent forth to harvest? Sergeant Valerius spoke of similar, lesser manifestations encountered by his patrols. What other horrors might be cultivating themselves in the irradiated, grief-soaked depths of Calth, nourished by 10,000 years of sorrow, patiently spreading their roots through the planet's psychic wounds? The butcher may be dead, its sanctuary purged. But the Calthan sorrow, the psychic trauma woven into the very fabric of this world, endures. And like any untended, poisoned garden, it remains fertile ground for whatever seeds of darkness might drift upon the recycled winds or be deliberately planted by forces unknown. I survived the veiled butcher, but I left a part of my certainty, perhaps a part of my sanity, down there in the darkness. And I fear the true horror beneath Calth's scarred surface is far from over. It is merely dormant, waiting, listening to the endless weeping of a world that never truly healed. And the memory of that cloying, sweet scent lingers, a promise or a threat of blooms yet to come.